Story of the World, Volume 3, Chapter 4, Part 2. Henry Hudson's Quest. While the colonies of Quebec and Jamestown struggled to survive, French and English explorers kept right on looking for a northwest shortcut on the ports of China and India. They wanted Eastern spices and silk, not North American wheat and fur. One of the most determined explorers was an Englishman named Henry Hudson. Hudson wrote to a friend, "He who finds the sure sea path to the Indies will be remembered for all time. I would that my name be carved on the tablets of the sea." But Henry Hudson's attempts to find the sea path to India would lead to his death. Hudson knew that dozens of sailors had already searched in vain for the Northwest Passage. But Hudson had a brand new idea. Instead of sailing west to North America and searching for a passageway through the continent, he wanted to sail straight up over the top of the globe and then down to Asia. He knew that in the summer, the sun shines on the North Pole all day and all night. Hudson was certain that all the sunlight would melt the ice so that his ship could get through. Hudson set out north on a tiny wooden ship, the Hopewell. For 6 weeks, the crew fought through rough, frosty seas. Dense, icy fogs settled around them. Rain froze into sheets of ice on the decks and sails. The men's hands were crisscrossed with sores from pulling on their ice-coated ropes. Huge fields of floating ice cakes forced Hudson off his planned course. Soon, Hudson was forced to turn his ship and head back for England. Back home, Hudson decided to try a new course for his second attempt. Perhaps he could sail northeast, traveling along the northern coast of Russia and then around the great landmass of China toward India. Another English adventurer, Sebastian Cabot, had already tried this route. His ships had been driven to shore by ice and frozen in. When fishermen found the ships a year later, no one was left alive. They were all frozen, reported one of the discoverers, some of them seated in the act of writing, pen still in hand and the paper before them, others at tables, plate in hand and spoon in mouth. But Henry Hudson was convinced that he would be more successful. He hired a new crew and started off in the spring when the northern waters would be free of ice. But after 3 months of sailing, Hudson's ship came up against a long, thin barrier of land. Hudson sailed along it looking for a way through. But the weather was beginning to grow colder. Ice was forming in the water. The crew begged their captain to turn back. Hudson agreed and turned the ship around. But he didn't head back toward England. He headed across the Atlantic toward North America. When his crew and his first mate, Robert Juet, realized that they weren't headed home, they threatened to mutiny. Once again, Hudson was forced to give up his journey and go back to England. A third attempt also failed. Hudson refused to give up. This time, he planned to go across to North America and sail into a narrow channel called Furious Overfall. Some English sailors thought that Furious Overfall might lead to the Northwest Passage, but no ship had ever managed to sail very far into Furious Overfall. Treacherous rocks, swirling, sucking whirlpools, and floating cakes of ice made the channel almost impassable. But Hudson wasn't discouraged. He found a ship, the Discovery. He collected a crew and appointed his young son John to be cabin boy. And once again he hired Robert Juet, the first mate who had joined in the mutiny on his second voyage. That was a mistake. Hudson, Robert Juet, and the crew sailed back across the Atlantic and into Furious Overfall. As the Discovery made its way through the channel, the tide began to pour away with alarming speed. Sharp rocks, which had been under the water's surface, suddenly jutted above the waves and threatened to tear at the Discovery's hull. Violent currents pushed the tiny ship back and forth. Enormous cakes of ice floated toward them, threatening to cave in the Discovery's fragile wooden sides. The sailors begged to turn back, but Hudson would not listen. For 6 weeks, they struggled to keep the ship away from the rocks as the water rose and fell. Finally, the strait began to grow wider. the Discovery came out into a wide, salt expanse of water, free of ice. At last, the crew thought, they had reached the Pacific Ocean. They sailed into this new stretch of water filled with hope. But suddenly a shore loomed up in front of them, cutting off their way. For weeks, Hudson sailed along this land looking for a passage through. The weather began to grow colder and colder. The crew began to mutter and complain. And when some of them told First Mate Jouet about their worries, he told them, "Keep your muskets charged and your swords ready. We'll need to use them before the voyage is over." Jouet was suggesting mutiny for the second time. As the water grew icier, Hudson's men were forced to haul the Discovery up onto the shore. Soon, ice had frozen it into place. Snow began to fall. The crew grew so hungry that they foraged along the shore, eating frogs. By the time the warm spring winds began to melt the ice, the crew of the Discovery was ready to go home. But Hudson ordered the crew to head west once more. One early summer morning, Hudson got up out of his bed in his private cabin and opened his door to check on the weather. Immediately, 3 men leaped out from behind the door, wrestled him to the ground, and tied his hands and feet. They dragged Henry, his son John, and 6 of the sickest sailors to the ship's tiny lifeboat and forced them in. They shoved the lifeboat into the bay, leaving Hudson and the sick men to die without food or water, and headed for home. But without its captain, the Discovery had a hard time finding the way back. The journey grew longer and longer. The crew ran out of food. They grew so hungry that they ate bird bones and the ship's candles, sprinkled with salt and vinegar. Robert Jouet died of starvation. By the time the Discovery reached England in the fall, only 5 men were still alive. Henry Hudson was never heard from again. But in his memory, Furious Overfall was renamed Hudson Strait. The huge body of water Hudson had discovered was called Hudson Bay. Later explorers discovered that Hudson Bay didn't go through to the Pacific at all. Hudson had been sailing along the shore of a huge landlocked body of water. Some people say that his ghost still wanders along its edge, looking for the way to India.